Hello all, and welcome to the October Patch Tuesday webcast. We will begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees that they're currently in listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask the panelists questions at any time, and we will answer them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi. A very warm welcome to everybody today on a very beautiful but very cold day here in the UK. We really appreciate you taking some time today over the next hour to learn about Patch Tuesday, third-party updates, Linux and macOS. And as usual, I have invited two specialists from my team to help me with some of their expertise. So John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Rob. Hey everybody, John Cassell, Senior Solutions Architect with Syxsense. I'm based in sunny California. Been working in IT for many years, specializing in desktop server operations, and I dabble in pre-sales, customer onboarding, and training here at Syxsense.
Wonderful, thank you, John. And Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Hi, everybody. My name's Pete. I work for Syxsense as a pre-sales consultant. I've been working for the company for about 5 years. Prior to my current role, I worked for an oil company where I managed a tool that at the time was called Landesk, and we used that to manage around 4,500 devices for software deployment, asset management, and of course, patch management, patch deployment.
Thank you, Pete. And again, my name's Rob Brown. I'm the Director of Services from our UK head office. And one of my teams are responsible for the security solutions within Syxsense, one of those being patch management. And over the last 15 or so years, we've deployed 100 million patches. So welcome to everybody. So we're going to start with some feedback. We've had some wonderful feedback since this series of webcasts began. It was about 6 months ago. And some of those are actually going to help us develop how we progress forward with these webcasts, what kind of content we're adding in and how we're developing it. One of them is that we actually are improving the value of the Linux and the Mac OS, and this is primarily a Windows Patch Tuesday webinar, but we will take the knowledge, the recommendations from the Linux and the Mac OS, and we will be putting that onto our website, so you can download that and subscribe to that if you want to. And also, we really enjoyed the news, so we're going to continue to add more news to this webcast going forward, and every one of those news articles will be posted to our web page as well. So we really appreciate your feedback. Please continue to send us notes. You can do so via the invites, also via Facebook and directly on the Syxsense website. So we're going to first talk about something that is very serious. It's the Windows XP source code was leaked, the source code leak. It has sort of been confirmed that that is the legitimate Windows XP source code. Now, many don't realize the gravity of this leak because most operating systems originate and are developed from that early version. You typically won't find an operating system being developed from scratch. Now, if you can see a vulnerability and access via that source code, that vulnerability that hasn't been patched in that version, then you might be able to create something for a future version of that operating system, and XP, became the next one become Windows 10. So if you can identify some old code that isn't used very regular, then it is possible for you to devise an exploit for the very latest version. And it may take lots of goes, but hackers do enjoy finding this source code. They understand then how the operating system was put together, and that's how they start developing their exploits going forward. Now, if you do a Google search for Patch Tuesday, some of the first articles you'll find will be Patch Tuesday is coming, time to disable Windows updates. We highly recommend that not be done. Just because you're not looking and using Windows updates to detect what updates are missing doesn't mean you're not vulnerable for those exploits. So please don't disable it. If you need a patching strategy, if you don't have a mechanism or a strategy to get you to the point of success in whichever tool you're using on our website, I'll show you in a moment, you'll be able to download our guide. Also, some good news for once. Microsoft are actually integrating the service stack updates into cumulative updates. Now, this isn't for everybody, so you will need to be using Windows 10 feature update 2004 with the September SSU applied. Going forward, you won't need to necessarily make sure you put the SSU update onto it first. The SSU update is very important. We have a slide on that in a second. But you do have to make sure the latest SSU is installed if it is needed for that operating system. Office 2010 went end of life yesterday, so that's actually a big milestone, potentially why there was some slightly less updates released in this Patch Tuesday, as they're sort of bringing some of their older software end of life. But I do want to bring something to your attention. Sometimes some of our clients are using older versions of specialist software, so Microsoft Project, Microsoft Visio. These are actually incredibly expensive applications, and to maintain them is very expensive. So you'll find that some of them are actually using old versions of that software from Office 2010 when it was significantly cheaper, and they're just using an older version of that software even though they're using Office 365. So those kinds of obsolete softwares are actually an entry point for exploits going forward. So if you are using obsolete software, we highly recommend you upgrade to the latest version because security fixes aren't going to be available any longer. We did bring a zero logon vulnerability to your attention a couple of times, but since the last Patch Tuesday, we've seen government have ordered their agencies to patch the zero logon vulnerability. This is a very, very serious vulnerability. It's actually in two parts. The first part is available now, and that is for the servers. And the second part is for your clients, and that's coming in Q1 of next year. You have to make sure you put on the first patch before you apply the second patch. So it is a two-stage rollout. So there is an article on our website for that. We highly recommend you take a look, make sure that you are covered for that. And also, lastly, Microsoft Edge was released with its latest security fixes and functionality improvements. Now, Edge is a bit of a unique browser in its current form because before it was a feature. So it was a Windows feature that actually got upgraded. Now it is an application, just like any other browser that you download it. You can download it, you can install it. If you install the latest browser, the feature needs to be disabled or uninstalled so that the binaries are removed from the system, and that removes the vulnerability. There isn't a direct upgrade sometimes between the feature version of Edge and the application version of Edge. So if you have both of them installed, but you're using the newest version of Edge, if the binary still exists from the original version, that could be enough in order for an exploit to occur. So we highly recommend that you uninstall if you're not using it. Okay, so John, I know you've done some research into some of the third parties that we should be prioritizing. Maybe you'd like to give us a rundown of those for me.
Sure thing. There have been a lot in the last month. Before jumping into it, I always want to mention that third-party updates are, of course, just as important as the OS updates. So do make sure to push those out to remedy potential vulnerabilities. There could be more than for the OS. Since last month, again, additional updates have been released. Last month, Adobe released patches for 18 separate flaws across multiple products, but fortunately this month, they only patched a single critical flaw within Flash Player. The remote code execution vulnerability can be exploited if the user visits a compromised website. This particular bug affects users on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and Chrome OS operating systems. Flash, of course, has been a source of various vulnerabilities for many years, and it will be soon coming to an end. Starting on December 31st of this year, Adobe will no longer distribute or update Flash, as well as all web browsers will no longer support the plugin. Google Chrome has also been updated a few times since last month, with a previous version in late September resolving upwards of 10 different vulnerabilities. The newest version, 86 from earlier this month, also resolved 35 different security flaws and introduced a new password feature. This update as well applies to multiple OS types such as Windows, Mac, Linux, and mobile versions of Android and iOS. Version 86 resolved a critical flaw existing in Chrome's payments component, as well as multiple high severity use after free flaws. The version was released on October 7th, so if it's still outstanding, you should definitely update as soon as possible. Additionally, the new password feature allows mobile OS versions to send a copy of users' usernames and passwords using a special form of encryption, and this in turn lets Google check those credentials against a list of passwords known to be compromised. I thought that was an interesting feature. It doesn't apply towards desktop versions at this time, at least not from my findings, but does for mobile versions. Microsoft Edge received a stable channel update on October 8th, as mentioned earlier, number of security fixes, resolving 19 separate CVEs in various areas of the web browser. This particular update does have a CVSS score of 9.8, making it critical. So if you have Edge and you're using it, make sure you update as soon as possible, and a high severity rating from Microsoft. There are also a number of new features such as automatic profile switching in older Windows operating systems, and the Internet Explorer mode to let Edge users test websites in IE mode. That was cool as well. Foxit Reader released version 10.1.0 in late September, introducing new improvements, but also resolving a number of high severity flaws. These bugs range from use after free to out of bounds, write, remote code, execution vulnerabilities, and should definitely be prioritized. Aside from this, new improvements include an enhanced 3D plugin. So if you're using Foxit Reader, some new cool visual improvements, delivering new visual features, an improved update process for the application itself. So maybe you don't really have to prioritize based on the new architecture. It might be easier to update, as well as other enhancements to the user experience per their website. Wireshark, which typically is, I've been mentioning a few times in these webinars now, so it's been getting some steady updates as well. Version 3.2.7 was also released in late September, resolving a few high severity vulnerabilities related to multiple dissector crashes in MIME, multipart, TCP, and BLIP protocols. There are also a number of other fixes resolved, but no new features for Wireshark. Additional products I won't get too much into that have been updated since last Patch Tuesday include Cisco WebEx, Citrix, Dropbox, Firefox, which I didn't prioritize like the others here on this slide, but I did want to mention it was updated actually to version 81 in mid-September, resolving multiple high severity flaws, decommissioning Firefox Send and Firefox Notes, but also introducing a new theme and some visual enhancements. But Mozilla has already updated Firefox since this month with no new major advisories for the latest release. There's also KeyPass, Notepad++, Opera, Skype, and Zoom. They've all gotten updates. Lastly, like always, my monthly reminder, always include third-party patching in your patch management process. It's not just about the OS updates. Any application can be considered a major vulnerability if it's not updated regularly.
That's wonderful, John. Thank you very much indeed. That's a brilliant update. I'm sure we'll try to transfer all of these as well onto our website. So if any of you are using these third parties, we highly recommend that you prioritize them. If you're using Syxsense, you'll actually see all of these already in your console ready to install. Okay, so Pete, I've actually been really excited about this because since everybody is now moving to work from an alternative location from their main office, I personally find that when they're at home, you find that they don't always conform to the clean desk standard and other things that they would within their company, I suppose. So you've got some hints and tips for us. I'd really like to see what you've been working on. Would you like to take us through it?
Yeah, sure thing, Rob. Thanks for that. So today I thought I would cover off 10 points that at a high level you may want to consider when trying to protect your environment against hackers, malware, viruses, that sort of thing. For some of you, I admit that for some of you this might be teaching grandma to suck eggs, but hopefully at least one or two of these points here will be useful to you. First slide, please, Rob. Okay, so antivirus. An obvious starting place is antivirus. Make sure that is at least installed on all of your devices and that it is up to date with regards to the AV definitions as well as the actual AV engine. Traditional antivirus products rely on the vendor being aware of any new threats. They must then build and publish a new AV definition to allow their product to deal with that threat. The new definition or even a new engine then needs to be deployed to each device. Moving on from that, the next generation or cybersecurity solutions have an AI function built into them. They can analyze both the behavior of the logged on user and of the actual system to determine whether the device is under attack or has been compromised in some way. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, patching the operating system. This is clearly very important when you are trying to protect the devices, and there is a lot to consider. You could choose to allow all the devices to automatically download and install any new patches that are required, and this is obviously the minimum amount of work by an IT department. But of course, you're at the mercy of the OS vendor as to whether any of those patches then cause an issue with any of your devices. If you're using a patch management solution tool, you can of course still deploy all patches with no testing if you wish, but you may wish to create some sort of testing or staged rollout process in order to reduce the risk of deploying a problematic patch to all of your devices. Bear in mind the location of your devices. That may have an effect on the success of your patch deployment process. An on-premise patch deployment tool may not be able to deploy patches that are not located in your office. Next slide, please, Rob. Thank you. Some sources claim that 70% of the total number of vulnerabilities on any given device are due to out-of-date applications running on that device. I think so. JC, John has sort of alluded to this already. So it's clearly very important that your patching process includes the deployment of third-party patches. Some applications can be set up to self-update. Whilst this is okay, it does mean that you have no control over the when the applications decide to update to the latest version. This, of course, could cause compatibility issues when end users are trying to share data. If you use a patch deployment tool that can deploy third-party patches, you can have far more control over which patches are deployed and when they are deployed. Next slide, please, Rob. You need to be sure that the OS and any applications running on it are still supported by the vendor. For example, Microsoft stopped publishing patches for Windows 7 on January the 14th, 2020. If you're still using this OS, you need to have purchased an extended security update license in order to allow you to patch this OS. Just because an OS has gone end of life, that doesn't mean that vulnerabilities don't exist for that, and that's what Rob mentioned earlier with the XP. There are people that are still using XP. They could exploit that directly or use the source code to determine if a later version, a later OS has a vulnerability. Windows 10 has similar constraints. If the feature update that the device is running on has fallen out of support, you need to upgrade that feature update to a version that is still in support in order to deploy patches to those devices. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, by leveraging the functionality of the operating system and applications running on it, you can help to secure these devices. Research and implement settings that you feel are relevant to your business. These could include browser settings, operating system settings, and features such as the firewall and BitLocker. Next slide, please, Rob. Along with the normal vulnerabilities that we're all aware of, there can be many vulnerabilities that cannot be easily remediated by an automatic process, but we still need to be aware of them. These can include issues such as weak passwords, accounts with passwords that never expire, account names that are obvious, such as admin or administrator. These are, prime attack points when someone's trying to hack into your into a device. Whilst I don't want to actually this section to be a blatant advert for Syxsense, I would like to point out that our product currently has over 600 scripts within Syxsense Secure looking for the vulnerabilities that fall into this category. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, educate your end users. Educate your users to make them aware of things that they can do in order to protect the company and its data. These can include things like locking the device at the logon screen, not leaving the device in view when transporting it, and also being wary of unsolicited emails. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, due to the recent events, which are fairly obvious, the trend towards working at home has greatly accelerated. This can cause problems for companies that are using on-premise and even some cloud-based solutions in order to manage their deployment process. Some of these tools do have limited ability to deploy patches to devices that are off the corporate network, but quite often extra hardware is required in order to enable this feature. Again, slight bigging up for our tool. Our cloud-based tool does not have any of these constraints. Next slide, please, Rob. Proactive protection. If your asset management tool has features that can alert you or even kill unwanted processes, then this can make use of, it's worth making use of such features. This can help stop the spread of malware, and it can even enforce the idea that a company device is actually a company device. It should not be handed over to your kids in order for them to play games on it. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, you should you could consider using devices that have chips built into the motherboard that allow you to remotely wipe the hard drive of any stolen device as soon as it is connected to the internet. If your devices do not have the required chipset, you could consider installing aftermarket software that can carry out the same function. This will obviously help prevent the data loss, which could otherwise result from a device being stolen. Yeah, hopefully you found 1 or 2 points there interesting, at least something to consider. So there we go. Back to you, Rob.
That's brilliant, Pete. Thank you very much. That's really good.
Problems.
So let's look at Patch Tuesday's release cadence. So if you're new, there is actually 3 or 4 Patch Tuesdays in a month. You've got the first Tuesday of the month, which is for non-security Office updates. And this month we had one for Office 2016, Project 2016, Visio 2016, and Skype for Business 2016. In the second Tuesday of the month, that's what we call Patch Tuesday, and that's your security fixes. And there were 87 of those released yesterday to fix a whole magnitude of vulnerabilities. We're going to go through some of the most important ones there. The good news is it's slightly less security fixes than we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months. The bad news is there's some really serious ones you need to prioritize. So although there's a lot less, there still is an urgency to make sure that you have a patching deployment performed straight away. The third Patch Tuesday of the month is reserved for .NET Framework updates, and that is non-security .NET Framework updates. And again, we have another month with no updates to deploy. That was third week of last month. And then we've got the special event of a zero day or an out of band vulnerability, and that can happen at any time. At any time of the whole month. It's based on when that vulnerability gets weaponized. So there were none of those to consider, but there is an advisory for the service stack updates we're going to talk about really quickly. So The thing about servicing stack updates is that they are critical prior to the install of later or of the newer Windows updates. So not all operating systems require the latest servicing stack installed. So only a few of them actually do require the latest servicing stack to be installed prior to the very latest Patch Tuesday. But if you are not installing it, or if you don't have a mechanism or a sophisticated tool set to do it, the installation of that patch could interact negatively with your hardware drivers. So sometimes hardware drivers, Dell, HP, Lenovo, they will give Microsoft a couple of DLLs, a couple of updated DLLs for their platform, and those are delivered within the servicing stack to enable the operating system and the hardware to work seamlessly. When that doesn't take place, there is a potential outcome of a conflict of a driver, and that's when you have some end user disruption that we're trying to eliminate. As I mentioned, the servicing stack updates are being embedded into a future release of Patch Tuesday, but only for Windows 10 when you're using the 2004 feature update. So if you're using anything before that, unfortunately, you still have to make sure you install these first. And now, how are we going to prioritize Patch Tuesday? Patch Tuesday can be prioritized many ways. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to recommend you do it. We use 6 factors to prioritize Patch Tuesday. 6 factors enable us to rank the severity of each and every vulnerability that's fixed. We use the vendor severity, which ranges from critical to low, and we use the independent CVSS score as well as that, which is from 10 to 0, 10 being critical, 0 meaning low or NA. We did a few webinars on the CVSS score. If you want to take a look at how it's constructed, it's fascinating how many layers they go through to prove the independence of a score. Please take a look at some of our previous webinars. Now, weaponized vulnerabilities, we actually had a few questions on weaponized vulnerabilities about what they are and how they are notified. So basically, weaponized vulnerabilities are bugs that are actively known and are actively being exploited. Vendors let the community know that a part of their operating system or application is being exploited. Somebody is using it to get in for data theft or for the spread of ransomware. Through that mechanism of being notified that there is active weaponized threats, they change the type of vulnerability that this is to a weaponized vulnerability, and that can lead to what we call a 0-day vulnerability. It can lead, especially if there's a large weaponization taking place. Now, weaponized means that it's actively being exploited, and public aware means that the bug to exploit is known. It is known typically through bug bounty programs, and the bug bounty program offers the vendor the ability to provide a patch within 3 months or to provide details of the bug itself for payment. When the vendor refuses, those bug bounty programs and those hackers can release the bug to the dark web, where it can be picked up. Now, when a public aware vulnerability exists but no patch exists, that's very serious. So let's just talk about public aware where a patch does exist. In this Patch Tuesday, we do have some public aware vulnerabilities we need to prioritize. A patch is available to remediate that public aware vulnerability. On the other side, you've got public aware vulnerabilities where a patch does not exist, and that is where you depend on a security vulnerability solution that actually scans your devices, scans your servers, and it looks for areas of the operating system weaknesses that need to be resolved in order to close the gap for any potential infection. Countermeasures are you have 2 types of countermeasure, and they're ones that can help us when a patch doesn't necessarily need to be installed. So countermeasures are mitigations. So you may be mitigated against the need to deploy the patch because maybe you have one of those next generation antiviruses and they can help you. Or you've got a workaround. So instead of installing the patch, you can apply a group policy change or a registry change or install something that effectively mitigates the need to install the patch. So when you put those together, you come up with a score that we use to rank every vulnerability. The only thing that's missing is your exposure. If you're a Syxsense customer, you're already benefiting from these 6 factors here. If you're not, then just take the CVE from the website we're about to see, pop it into your patch management tool, and see how many devices need each one of those patches. And obviously, the more devices, the higher the priority you should tend to those. So let's take a look at the Patch Tuesday release. Now, we don't actually put the Patch Tuesday into this webinar, this webcast, because we want you to take it offline. We want you to use it. So we've actually popped it on our website. So if you go to syxsense.com, I'll bring it across. So over here, this actually has been updated, so it looks really nice. But along the top, you'll see that there's a news page. Now this news page has its own Patch Tuesday holding page, but I highly recommend that you go to the news page itself. Inside the news page, you'll find all of the articles that we've written for all of the vulnerabilities for both Microsoft, Linux, Mac OS, and third party. If you want, then you can talk to one of our techies, or if you want to start a trial, you can use the free trial button up there. The October Patch Tuesday, as I mentioned, is available online right now. If you want to receive an email of the latest Patch Tuesday material, you can actually fill in your details here and subscribe, and you'll get an email every single time we release an article. And as I mentioned before, right at the beginning, it is very, very important that you have a patching strategy. And doesn't matter which tool you're using, there are many ways of using that tool to its best of its ability. And on each of these pages, if you spend here just a minute or so, you get a little link to download a patching strategy. So it's our top 10 recommendations for what you should be using, or how you should be using your tool to effectively remediate your environment from any risk. So there are 87 vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, released yesterday, 11 critical, 75 important, and 1 moderate. And as I mentioned, although the number is much, much less than we've seen, potentially 30, 40 less than we've seen recently, there are 6 vulnerabilities that are publicly aware. So we still have some urgent work to be getting on with. If you're still using Windows 7, and we know lots of our clients are, you're still using Windows 7 with that extended support, there are 23 vulnerabilities for you yesterday, 2 critical and 21 for each operating system for Windows 7 and 2008, including R2. Now, we've gone through the list, me and my team, and we've chosen 3 that I'm going to recommend. And I know John and Pete, you've got your recommendations as well. But I'm going to give my top 3 first. My first recommendation is 16898. Now, 16898 is my number 1 pick. It's the Windows TCP/IP remote code. It's a remote code execution vulnerability. It has a CVSS score of 9.8, which is as close to a 0-day as I feel you can get. But it does have a countermeasure available. It does have a countermeasure. We're going to go into that in a second. That's probably why it's not a CVSS score of 10. Now, it affects every operating system from Windows 10 through 2016 Server, 2019 Server, and Server Core. And the workaround is to disable the ICMP v6 RDNSS using a PowerShell command. If you go to that link, you'll find the actual PowerShell command that you can write. You need to send it to every machine, and that will effectively work around the vulnerability. Microsoft strongly recommends that you install the update even if you plan to leave the workaround in place. So they're saying you can leave the workaround in place even after you install the patch. Good news is there's no reboot needed. So for your distributed environment, this is very easy to implement before pushing out the patch. Since no reboot is needed, it reduces end user disruption. My next one is 16891. That's a Windows Hyper-V remote, and it is a remote code execution vulnerability as a CVSS score of 8.8, and it's in the top 3 of the highest CVSSs for this month with no countermeasure. Now, this affects everything from Windows 7 through to Windows Server 2019. Now, when I put the score together, the reason I believe this is the most important is because with lots of IT members now working from home, what we're learning that our clients are using is they're using a laptop and they're using virtual machines on the laptop to connect into the secure areas of the network. So they're not using their machine directly from their VPNing to their corporate network. They're using their machine to run a VM that then connects into their corporate network. And that is for safety, purely for security of the data spread, almost like a sandbox. So you can't spread data from one environment to the next. You really cannot afford not to install this if that is the strategy you're using to protect your most valuable IT staff working from home that are looking after your environment. It's really important that gets installed so that the vulnerability for exposing that is closed. Now this almost, the next one, it was almost my number one. I'll explain. It's 16909. It's a Windows error reporting, and it is an elevation of privilege vulnerability. It has a CVSS score of 7.8 with no countermeasure. However, it is publicly aware, which means weaponization could happen really quickly. So it affects everything from Windows 10, Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2019, and Server Core. And this is the reason why it's very, very serious. An attacker that successfully exploits this vulnerability could gain access to the system. That's normal. But it can be done through something called a fileless attack, also known as a zero footprint attack. They don't actually need to deliver anything to your machine to expose it. They don't need the user to install a piece of software or to copy a binary. Now, because it's happening without the copying of a file or the install of a software, some next generation antiviruses won't pick it up. And certainly some of the more traditional antiviruses won't either. So they are likely to miss it. That's why I almost made this my top pick, but actually the one at the top there is according to the six scores that we use, actually just topped it. So that's my 3. Please put those CVEs into your tool set, search for them. If you have them in your environment and they are vulnerable, highly recommend that they be prioritized as part of your patching strategy. So we also have underneath here all of the other patches that were released, and we've got the 6 factors here already filled in for you, just transferring the CVE to your tools as I mentioned. So I know, John, you've got a really good update for us to prioritize. Would you like to give us the CVE number?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. This will be for CVE 2020-16947. This is for a Microsoft Outlook remote code execution vulnerability. It has a CVSS score of 8.1 with a severity of critical. Basically, an attacker who successfully exploits the vulnerability could run arbitrary code in the context of the system user. If the current user is logged in with administrative user rights, an attacker could take control of the affected system. An attacker could then install programs, view, change, delete data, or even create new accounts with full system rights. Users whose accounts are configured to have fewer user rights on the system could be less impacted than users who operate with administrator user rights. And that might actually be more common lately, given a lot of devices have gone home, so that could be actually more frequent than we think. This is obviously a common scenario in which we as admins want to start with the principle of least privilege, since too much power increases that risk. Also, because the preview pane, specifically with Outlook, is an attack vector, victims don't even need to open the mail to be impacted here. The specific flaw exists within the parsing of HTML content in an email.
Oh, wow. So literally they just get an email and bang, they can be exploited just by receiving an email, not even meaning to open it. Oh wow, that's brilliant. I can see why you prioritized it. Thank you for that, John. That's really good. Pete, you have one as well.
I certainly do, Rob. I think I may have come in third place here in more ways than one, because the one I've picked only has a score of 7.5, but nevertheless I still think it's interesting. So here we go. It's 16896. I'll just let you find that.
Not seeing it.
Unless yeah, 1689896.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh, remote desktop.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, so I spotted this vulnerability. It concerns Windows Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. It's an information disclosure vulnerability, and as I said, it has a score, CVSS score of 7.5. An attacker that successfully exploits this vulnerability could then obtain further information which will allow them to compromise the user's system. Microsoft strongly recommend that you install the update to remediate this vulnerability. However, there is a workaround that you could also consider. Basically, this involves disabling remote desktop services, assuming that you no longer use it, obviously. Having said that, Microsoft still recommend that you install the updates, so read into that what you will. Other things that you can consider implementing include enabling network level or network level authentication, or NLA, which will block unauthenticated attackers from exploiting this vulnerability. With an NLA turned on, an attacker would first need to authenticate to a remote desktop service using a valid account on the target system before the attacker could exploit this vulnerability. So clearly that tightens things up to a degree there. The second configuration change that you can make is to block TCP port 3389 at the enterprise perimeter firewall. This port is used to initiate the connection with the affected component. Blocking this port at the network perimeter firewall will help protect the systems behind that firewall from any attempts to exploit this vulnerability.
That's great, Pete. Thank you. I think we've had several RDP 0 days recently, so yeah, I can definitely see why you prioritized it. And that's,
I mean,
really
RDP is on every single device, isn't it? So
yeah. Even the binary, even if you're not using it, if it's there, it can be used to compromise.
Yeah, should have a higher score.
But it might do. You never know.
Yeah,
CVSS,
that's the thing.
CVSS actually do change, and if you haven't had a chance to read that, I mentioned before, if you haven't had a chance to watch the webinar, please do so on the CVSS algorithm. It does actually change. So when this is a 7.5, but if something changes that makes that now more exploitable in an easier form or easier way, that definitely jumps up. We've seen it plenty times before. That's brilliant. Thank you, Pete.
No problems.
Okay, as I mentioned right at the start as well, we do have a managed service for patch management, and we do bring issues that we detect to the webcast. Now, we haven't found these issues in all of our testing, but they are in the community, so we feel it's valuable to bring it to you. This is an oldie. This has been around for a very long time. If you're patching 2008 R2 servers, then some operations may fail on clustered shared volumes. Please, all we can recommend in this case is perform your testing. Make sure you're using a test server before you apply it to any live cluster servers. And lastly, Windows 10. Now, we haven't also seen this ourselves, but there is report that some third-party drivers may error. So the machine is fully functional. Patch Tuesday updates are applied, and after the reboot, it says unable to verify publisher for some drivers. Microsoft is suggesting you contact the driver vendor or the OEM vendor to get the issue corrected. So it may be something to do with the security of the driver interacting with the operating system. You may need to download the newest driver. In this case, driver issues are notoriously difficult to troubleshoot. So please, again, your testing needs to be performed against a representative of your environment. And if you would like, that patching strategy does include our recommendations for what you should be using for a good patching test in your patching strategy. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left, and we're just going to cover off a few feature updates first. So I know, John, there's been some updates to this feature update roadmap, especially since, as they say, it's changed due to public health situations. So do you want to just walk us through briefly what the roadmap currently looks like?
Yeah, you definitely mentioned exactly what I was going to say. It's changed a lot, and we mentioned in previous webinars that a lot of these end-of-life dates that were originally slated to be 18 months for consumer, 30 months for enterprise have been shifted around. Typically, a lot of the interim versions are getting extended about 6 months. So we can see those that in the list in the spreadsheet or in the PowerPoint have asterisks there. Those are actually slated to expire 6 months prior to that. So they have been extended, and some are even standardized to the same date. Yesterday, one of these versions specifically reached end of life. That is Windows 10 version 1709 for enterprise and education. This was originally scheduled for actually end of life back in April of this year, but was extended due to COVID-19, like the other versions here as well. So if you happen to be running these out-of-date versions, any of them from this sheet that are in yellow, just think about updating, and of course, anything that's in red, you should update as soon as possible, because that was actually the last Patch Tuesday that you received updates. So you're actually heavily out of date. Fortunately, only one of those was yesterday, so no updates would have been released since, but any other date, some of them are going on many years now.
Yep, brilliant, thank you.
Long-term service channel, one of these has also come to an end for mainstream support, but it's still extended support till 2025. This will be for the original version of long-term back from 2015. Mainstream had just ended. And still be getting updates for the most part, though, for at least extended security issues.
Super
and
duper.
then I'd like to just mention briefly as well for Windows 10 2009. Not much data on it yet within the industry. It's still within testing from Microsoft. We were expecting it to be released yesterday, but no word from Microsoft on that. The latest feature update, commonly called Windows 10 October 2020, Windows 10 20H2, or most commonly known, just simply version 2009, was not released this month, and Microsoft is yet to announce when it will start rolling out to the public. So with that being said, Windows insiders in the beta and release preview channel can still get the version, still test it, and download the newest build with some recently received fixes yesterday, but still no public release. The new version isn't really going to be different. If anyone's familiar with 1909 from last year, it was just simply kind of a small step up, almost like a minor service pack to the version before 1903, and that is what we're expecting. So not many changes, although there's one that end users are definitely going to notice. It's going to be that the start menu has been greatly improved. There's some new themes, and the new Microsoft Edge is going to be the default.
Brilliant. That's really great. Thank you, John.
For Mac OS, there's a supplemental update, was released at end of last month. As listed, might be possibly the last one before Big Sur. Fixed a few stability issues. There are some specific issues for particular models, so do always make sure if you've got a Mac to check, do you have the latest or is there going to be is there an update outstanding that you should prioritize? It is a rather large update, but does resolve a number of issues. Also want to state regarding Mac, as we did last time, we were expecting that an update for the OS itself, going from, well, after now many years since OS X was released for version 10, we're expecting Big Sur this month. Still no news really. It appears we're still waiting for Mac OS version 11, again codenamed Big Sur, to be released. It was speculated again to be released this month, but at least hinted on this week, but still no update. Just a bit of information on that one as well. This version of the OS introduces a refinished design very similar to Apple's mobile iOS platform, with new end features brought over from the mobile design, such as the control center for the Mac, for the first time providing easier access to base system functions like volume controls, brightness, network status, as well as improved messaging from what I hear.
I'm also looking at the size. You said it's a relatively small one. 2.6 gigabytes for an update is it's actually quite large. That'd be quite of a nightmare to deploy over a large over a network. Yeah.
Still not as big as a feature 10 update though.
No, only half, probably two gigabytes smaller.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And then a number of advisories for Linux. Of course, there are multiple distributions when it comes to OS types like Linux. So not to get particular into any of them, but at the very top, we have a list here that is color coding the highest severity packages. Now, any packages for Linux should always be applied, just like any operating system, any application, anything that requires an update. The higher the severity, though, definitely prioritize. Now, there are two kind of aspects to Linux. Of course, it is going to be typically a safer approach to patch, but it's going to be more of a headache compared to Windows. Operating systems and families such as any version of Windows are centrally managed, and Linux across various distributions, not so much. Depends on the distribution and depends on what configuration you've already got preset. So it might be an easier process, but it's typically going to involve a lot less risk. Either way, the risk is greater if you're not deploying the updates, so make sure that you deploy those as soon as possible.
And I think I mention every time I'm sort of astounded why, if it's critical, important, medium, low, why the CVSS is so different to the vendor severity. So I think it's very important that you have a very independent view of what the operating system is classifying as an urgent update to install. And that's why having the two together in a tool set is really useful. And if your tool doesn't have CVSS, I think this is actually what we've been asked on previous webinars to transfer to its own web page on our website, so that if you are using Red Hat, if you are using Amazon AWS, and you want to see what the most important patches to prioritize, it's just downloading the website. You don't have to come to the webinar to watch it. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. I think we've got probably 5 minutes. Maybe Heidi, we have some questions, or is there any questions we can answer at this point?
Yeah, so there's still time if anybody wants to ask some more questions, but we do have a few. The first one, let me pull it up, was somebody said something about proactive protection, and then they said they talked about alerts that can be triggered by a device, and surely that is a reactive process, not proactive.
I think that might have been me that said that, actually. Yeah, I think that is a fair point, actually, and I agree. I guess that an alert being triggered is a reactive event. I suppose what I was alluding to was that you could set, if your tool allows it, you could set alerts up and set the rules up, the alert rules up prior to any of these events, and therefore you're proactively putting systems into place before that event occurs. And obviously if the event occurs, then that alert can trigger a reactive situation there, which could be to quarantine the device or send you an email, at least saying, hey, this process is running on this device, that type of thing, or even kill that process. That'd be quite a fairly obvious one to do. So I think that's what I meant by proactive events for alerting.
Thanks, Pete. That's great. The next question is, what's the greatest vulnerability to a device?
John?
Answer that. I've had questions like this before, and the answer is time and time again, the end users themselves. I would say that proper training paired with the right tools can easily secure those choices that they make related to their behavior, like the sites they visit, the items they click on, so that they won't lead to something dangerous. Of course, we can look at applications being used, the operating system, but if the device isn't turned on, there's no risk. And who needs the device? The end user. So it's the choices really that they make in their behavior, I would say. You guys can chime in if you want. If there's anything else
I
that you
agree.
think of.
I didn't want to say the user, but now you've mentioned it first.
They're the root of all ailments, really, aren't they? Users.
What was that saying? Problems between the chair and the keyboard?
I think so, yes, quite often, yeah.
I've heard that before.
Yeah, I think support teams would concur with that.
That's all the questions that attendees have put in. I don't know if you guys want to have some closing comments.
I was just going to add, actually, Rob, you mentioned about the CVSS score being independent, and obviously in earlier webinars that we've done, I've been talking about the CVSS score, and I think I summed it up fairly well. I mean, it's slightly cynical, but if you were the vendor of an application, would it always be in your best interest to publicly announce that you've got a vulnerability in your application and it's a really, really severe critical vulnerability? You know, there could be a temptation there to play down the severity of a vulnerability in your own application. And that's where I think the CVSS score has a great advantage, because it doesn't care who the vendor is. It goes through that algorithm and a score comes out the end of it. And furthermore, as you mentioned earlier as well, that score can actually change. So, if there's no actual patch to remediate that vulnerability, it pushes the score up. If that vendor then produces a patch, it will be reanalyzed and a lower score will be published for that, along with obviously many other factors that can push the score up and down. So I think that's a great plus point. You know, whereas generally a vendor score, once it's published, they don't tend to change the score anyway. So, you know, it's much more real world. I didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking about CVSS, so I've saved it till now.
And if anyone wants to us to cover anything more about CVSS, please write us a comment or in the chat or on the website. It's such a huge part of the independent scoring of any vulnerability that there's actually adjustments to it being made all the time. I think CVSS score is now to 3.1. You know,
yeah, it's very mature, isn't it?
You know, 10 years ago it was 2, and it's actually now 3.1. That just goes to show that although it may be not having huge advances in version number, the scope of what it's using to rank a vulnerability is really, really good from that independent side. We just wish that it was a little bit, it had extra, like we use for how we rank a vulnerability is also based on whether it's weaponized, public aware. Countermeasures do also balance the risk. That is what we're developing going forward as inside the Syxsense console, because we feel that that is something in addition to it, but the independence is second to none.
Great, thanks so much, guys. I believe we're out of time, but I appreciate all of your insight and information. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Lovely.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and we really appreciate your time. We know it's very precious, and we really look forward to seeing you back in November. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye everyone.